The rain in San Diego always carries a salty tang, tasting much like that gray morning at Pearl Harbor 40 years ago. My arthritis always flares up in this gloom, a permanent souvenir left to me by the sinking of the Yorktown Today. The television is playing a special program commemorating the 40th anniversary of the victory at Midway. On the screen, young pilots smile at the camera, smiles that have yet to witness hell. But I turned the TV off. History books always write it simply. On June 4th, 1942, the U.S. Navy defeated the Imperial Japanese Combined Fleet at Midway, a single short sentence that wipes away all the fear, the desperation, and the sheer madness of it all. I am Thomas Halloway. Back then, I was just a 26-year-old Navy lieutenant. I was not the kind of hero who soared through the skies. I did not pilot a dauntless dive bomber, nor did I release torpedoes. My battlefield had no smoke. It held only mountains of punch cards, the suffocating smell of stale tobacco, and an intelligence station buried beneath Oahu, codenamed the Dungeon. I had the fortune, or misfortune, of becoming the connecting point between Joseph Rochefort's band of mad mathematical geniuses and the terrifyingly cool brain of Admiral Chester Nimitz. If the pilots wrote victory with bombs upon the surface of the sea, then we, in the darkness, used logic and intuition to light a faint lamp for them. This is the story of how we turned the tables in a gamble we were destined to lose. The turning point did not begin with the cannon fire at Midway, but in the murky waters off Australia in January 1942. At that time, the Pearl Harbor attack was barely a month behind us. The main battleships of the Pacific Fleet were still lying in the mud of the harbor, belching black smoke, and the entire west coast of the United States was shrouded in the panic of an imminent Japanese landing. Our days in the intelligence department were like purgatory, facing nothing but bad news. Wake Island had fallen. Manila was in peril. Late one night, at the end of January, I was called into Lieutenant Commander Rochefort's office. It was a cramped space in the basement of the 14th Naval District building, the air forever thick with the scent of coffee and aged cigars. Rochefort was an eccentric. He wore a purple velvet smoking jacket and shuffled around in a pair of old slippers, a complete violation of Navy uniform regulations. But in The Dungeon, he was God. Halloway, shut the door. His voice was raspy, his eyes bloodshot, but they gleamed with a feverish intensity I had only ever seen in the eyes of a gambler. Australia has sent us a gift. He pointed to a report on his desk that was wet, damp, and even smelled faintly of decomposition. "What is this?" I asked. "This is the autopsy report of the Japanese submarine I-124, Rochefort sneered. On January 20th, this unlucky sub was laying mines off Darwin when it was gang-tackled by our destroyer, the USS Edsall, and 3 Australian warships. She sank in only 47 meters of water." I opened the report, my stomach churning. It detailed how divers from the submarine tender USS Holland had descended to the wreck. They used oxyacetylene torches to cut through the pressure hull. Inside was hell. Dozens of Japanese sailors, crushed by water pressure, floating in the murky, flooded compartments like a horrific soup. "The divers groped through the pile of dead men," Rochefort whispered, "and they found this." It was a photograph. The photo showed a lead-weighted satchel, carefully wrapped in oilcloth JN25B. Rochefort spat out the code name as if reciting a spell. The Imperial Japanese Navy's latest operational codebook. The Japanese thought it would rot on the ocean floor with the sub, or that the captain would destroy it, but it seems the captain died too quickly. This was the beginning of the miracle. In peacetime, we know that raising a submarine is for rescue, like the tragedy of the Russian Kursk people would talk about later. But in that brutal war, we watched every shipwreck like vultures. This blood-scented codebook became the Rosetta Stone in the hands of Rochefort's team. Before this, we could only guess at Japanese naval communications through traffic analysis, knowing who was transmitting, but not what they were saying. It was like watching people argue through thick glass. But with the code book from the I-124, the glass was shattered. We began to hear fragments of their voice. However, decryption was not instant. JN25, Japanese Navy Code System 25, was extremely complex, consisting of 5-digit random number groups with a secondary additive table for encryption. Even with the codebook, without the pattern of the additive tables, it was still just gibberish. Life in the dungeon became even more frantic. Mathematicians, linguists, and even crossword puzzle champions were drafted in. The IBM punch card machines roared day and night like tireless beasts. By April, although we couldn't fully read every telegram, we began to catch some terrifying signals. Isoroku Yamamoto was not satisfied with his victories in the south. On the contrary, he was planning something bigger that was the beginning of all nightmares. By late April, the Battle of the Coral Sea erupted. Although we strategically checked the Japanese advance on Port Moresby, tactically we suffered heavy losses. The carrier Lexington was sunk, and the Yorktown was heavily damaged. Yet the volume of Japanese radio traffic did not decrease. Instead, it showed an eerie surge. Rochefort called me to the map table. The massive chart of the Pacific was thick with little flags representing Japanese movements. "Look here and here." His finger traced a line between Saipan and the Truk Islands, massive radio communications, and a code that keeps appearing, AF. Where is AF? This question became the nightmare of the entire Pacific Fleet Intelligence Department. The bureaucrats in Washington, specifically the Redman brothers at OP-20G, Navy Command Communications, sat in their comfortable offices, stubbornly insisting that AF referred to the Aleutian Islands, or Hawaii itself, or perhaps even San Francisco on the West Coast. They warned that the Japanese were going to attack the U.S. mainland. "Those idiots," Rochefort roared in the office, crumpling a memo from Washington and throwing it into the wastebasket. "If Yamamoto wants to attack San Francisco, he'd have to line up oil tankers across the Pacific. Logistically, it makes no sense." Rochefort was convinced AF was Midway. His basis was not just intuition. Months earlier, we had intercepted a reconnaissance report from a Japanese seaplane pilot who mentioned passing a certain coordinate near AF. A genius cartographer under Rochefort calculated that the coordinate could only be Midway, but this was just deduction. Although Admiral Nimitz trusted Rochefort, he could not bet the last remaining assets of the Pacific Fleet on a deduction. At that time, we only had 2 intact carriers, the Enterprise and the Hornet. If the judgment was wrong and we sent the fleet to Midway while the Japanese raided San Francisco or Hawaii, it would be a nation-ending mistake. We needed hard evidence. One day in mid-May, Lieutenant Commander Jasper Holmes, an intelligence officer whose eyes were sunken from exhaustion, proposed a plan that sounded like a child's prank. "Since we don't know if AF is Midway," Holmes said, rubbing his temples, "why don't we let Midway tell us?" "What do you mean?" I asked. "Midway has an underwater cable connecting it to Hawaii. It's a secure landline. The Japanese can't tap it." Holmes's eyes flashed with a cunning light. "We order the base commander at Midway to send an emergency report to Pearl Harbor via radio. Remember, using unencrypted radio that the Japanese can hear, stating that the seawater distillation plant on the island has broken down and fresh water is running out." Rochefort listened, and the corners of his mouth slowly turned up, revealing his only smile of the week. "That is a brilliant idea. If AF isn't Midway, the Japanese won't care if its water machine is broken." As the liaison officer, I immediately sprinted to Nimitz's headquarters with this proposal. Admiral Nimitz listened to the briefing, his piercing blue eyes staring at me for a moment. Then he nodded. "Approved. Do it, Lieutenant Halloway." The next 48 hours were the longest wait of my life. The Midway base faithfully executed the order. They broadcast a frantic message to Pearl Harbor on an unencrypted frequency. Seawater evaporator has suffered a critical malfunction. Fresh water supply on the island is critical, requesting emergency support. The radio waves traversed the Pacific and were intercepted by Japanese listening stations on Wake Island and Kwajalein Atoll. Now, the ball was in Japan's court. In the dungeon, all the IBM machines stopped. Everyone held their breath. The only sound was the click-click of Rochefort's lighter. The intercept operators pressed their headphones tight, fingers making micro-adjustments on the frequency dials, hunting for the slightest movement from Tokyo or Truk. 2 days later, we intercepted a secret message from Japanese naval intelligence sent to the combined fleet headquarters. The Japanese-American ensign responsible for decoding it was shaking with excitement. He handed the translated draft to Rochefort. Rochefort took one look and slammed his hand on the table. The loud bang nearly made me jump out of my skin. "Got him!" he roared. He handed the message to me. There was only a single line on the paper, but it carried the weight of the world. AF is short on fresh water. Attack force is to bring fresh water distillation equipment and supplies. AF was Midway. The proof was ironclad. A cheer, suppressed for too long, erupted in the basement. Those usually serious, stoic mathematicians hugged each other. Some even wept. On this battlefield without smoke, we had just won the most critical engagement. The people in Washington shut their mouths. All arguments were over. But this was just the beginning. As we further cracked the JN-25B code, thank God, due to various administrative blunders, the Japanese had delayed the change to the new JN-25C code from April 1st to late May, and then to June, giving us a fatal window of opportunity. Yamamoto's entire Operation MI plan unfolded before us like a jigsaw puzzle. It was not just an attack plan, it was a war machine so massive it was suffocating. Time of attack, early June, estimated June 4th or 5th, designated by the Japanese as N-Day. Force composition, a desperate lineup. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo leading the first mobile force, Kido Butai, possessing 4 heavy aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu. This was the original team that struck Pearl Harbor, the most elite naval aviation force in the world. Follow-up forces, Yamamoto himself, sitting on the super battleship Yamato, leading a massive main fleet lying in ambush in the rear. Strategic intent. Occupying Midway was just bait. Their real goal was to lure the U.S. Pacific Fleet out for a rescue, and then, with overwhelming force a decisive battle at sea to annihilate us completely. Looking at the Japanese forces marked on the chart, cold sweat soaked my shirt. "Admiral," I looked at Nimitz, "this is an invincible armada. How do we fight this?" Nimitz stood by the window, looking out at Pearl Harbor. The wreckage of the battleship Arizona was still visible above the water, like a tombstone. "We won't fight a decisive battle, Halloway." Nimitz turned, his eyes cold as iron. "We are going to ambush them. To set an ambush at Midway, we needed carriers. We had the Enterprise, CV-6, and the Hornet, CV-8. But that wasn't enough. 2 against 4 was suicide against Nagumo. We needed a third. We needed the Yorktown, CV-5. She had been battered into a floating wreck at the Battle of the Coral Sea. A bomb had penetrated the flight deck and exploded in the belly of the Leviathan. Near misses had ruptured the hull, causing fuel leaks. When she limped into the Pearl Harbor dry dock, charred and with twisted steel plates, she looked like she should be scrapped. Expert assessment. 3 months to repair. "I want her back at sea in 3 days, Nimitz issued the command that brooked no argument. The next 72 hours saw a miracle in industrial history. 1,400 dock workers swarmed the ship. The arc lights of welders turned the dry dock into daylight during the night. Workers cut away destroyed bulkheads, patched huge holes with plywood, and to save time, abandoned complex circuit repairs to string temporary cables. I stood at the edge of the dry dock, watching it all. The air was filled with the smell of burnt metal and the sweat of workers. This wasn't just ship repair, they were patching the lifeline of America. On the morning of May 30th, the Yorktown sounded her whistle and slowly moved out of Pearl Harbor. Although she still carried wounds and hundreds of civilian workers were still hammering away on board, they would be offloaded at sea, she was resurrected. Rear Admiral Fletcher hoisted his flag. We had 3 carriers. Nimitz devised an ambush plan codenamed Point Luck. We deployed the fleet 200 nautical miles northeast of Midway. It was a perfect ambush position. When the Japanese planes went to bomb Midway, their carriers would be exposed to our flank. In late May, as the intelligence liaison, I boarded the Enterprise with Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance. Spruance, originally a cruiser commander, was temporarily appointed to command the carrier task force because Admiral Halsey was hospitalized with a severe skin rash. Many doubted he understood aerial warfare, but I knew he possessed a mind as precise as a computer. Before the fleet departed, I met Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, commander of Torpedo Squadron 8, VT-8. He was a tough man with Sioux Indian blood, his eyes deep and melancholic. In the officers' club on the Hornet, he was drinking his last glass of whiskey. Halloway. He looked at me, rubbing a photo of his family in his hand. I don't believe those optimistic reports from upstairs. I know what we're facing: Zeros, the fastest killers in the world. And what are we flying? TBD Devastators. Damn flying coffins. The TBD torpedo bomber had a top speed of only 200 miles per hour and had to fly low and straight to drop a torpedo. It was essentially a sitting duck in the sky. Then why go? I asked a foolish question. Waldron smiled, a smile that accepted death. Because that's our job. I told my boys, if there is only one plane left, I want that pilot to go in and get a hit. I didn't know then that this prophetic vow would turn into a bloody reality just days later, June 4th, 1942. Dawn. The weather in the Midway area was treacherous and changeable. Our fleet was hidden beneath the clouds, maintaining absolute radio silence. Over 200 nautical miles to our west, Nagumo's massive fleet was bathed in the morning light. The intelligence was accurate to a terrifying degree. At 4:30 a.m., just as Rochefort predicted, the first wave of 108 Japanese planes roared off the 4 carriers and headed for Midway. At 5:30 a.m., a PBY Catalina flying boat from Midway sent back the message that changed history. Many enemy planes heading Midway, followed by enemy carriers sighted. On the bridge of the Enterprise, the alarm shrieked through the air. All waiting was over. The hunter became the hunted. The prey became the hunter. Rear Admiral Spruance made the most important decision of the entire battle. Launch everything. According to standard tactical doctrine at the time, we should have waited for all planes to launch and form up in the air before proceeding. But that would take an hour. Spruance knew the window of opportunity was fleeting. He ordered the planes to fly toward the target the moment they lifted off. We need to catch the Japanese carriers while they are servicing planes on deck, Spruance told his chief of staff. The time is now. This decision caused extreme chaos in the American attack waves. Fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers were completely separated in the air. The iron fist that should have struck in unison turned into scattered fingers, but this seemingly chaotic sortie, by some twist of fate, brewed a disaster for the Japanese. 9:20 a.m. Lieutenant Commander Waldron and Torpedo Squadron 8, VT-8, were alone, even at the very end. Due to cloud cover and navigational disagreements, the dive bombers from the Hornet flew in the wrong direction and missed the enemy. But Waldron, relying on that hunter's instinct, was certain the Japanese were to the southwest. He disregarded course instructions from superiors and led his 15 TBD torpedo bombers away from the main group, straight toward the Japanese fleet. When they broke out of the clouds, the sight was despairing. 4 Japanese carriers in formation, with escorting battleships and cruisers spewing a dense net of anti-aircraft fire. What was worse, there was not a single American fighter plane to protect them. And the Japanese Zero fighters dropped from high altitude like a swarm of angry hornets. In the intelligence room on the Enterprise, I wore headphones, monitoring that frequency. It was the most tragic sound I have ever heard in my life. This is George. My God, there are too many of them. Jimmy's hit. Jimmy's on fire. Keep formation. Keep formation. Go in. That was Waldron's voice, heartbreakingly calm. No tactical maneuvering, no hope of survival. The clumsy TBDs were like lambs to the slaughter against the agile Zeros. One after another, trailing long plumes of black smoke, they plunged into the sea. Major Waldron's plane took a hit to the fuel tank. Before crashing, he reportedly tried to stand up in the cockpit to direct his men. Finally, he vanished in a ball of fire. 15 planes, 30 pilots and gunners, total annihilation. Only Ensign George Gay miraculously survived the crash, hiding under a seat cushion floating in the sea, becoming the sole witness to the massacre. Next came Torpedo Squadron 6, VT-6, from the Enterprise, led by Lieutenant Commander Lindsay. The same tragedy played out again. They were torn to shreds by the Zeros of 14 planes. Only 4 survived. Then came Torpedo Squadron 3, VT-3, from the Yorktown. In that long, bloody hour, the American torpedo bomber force was almost wiped out. The most despairing part was that after paying such a heavy price, not a single torpedo hit a Japanese ship. The Japanese carriers continued to maneuver at high speed, unscathed. It was now 10:20 a.m. On the Japanese flagship Akagi, Vice Admiral Nagumo and his Chief of Staff Ryunosuke Kusaka must have been celebrating. They had repelled wave after wave of American attacks. Their Zero fighters were invincible. On their decks, the second wave of attack aircraft was fully armed with bombs and torpedoes, waiting only for the last few Zeros covering the Midway strike force to land and refuel before taking off to annihilate the American carriers. However, they did not know that the blood of Waldron and his comrades had not been spilled in vain. It was a brutal tactical exchange. Because of the suicidal low-level attacks by the American torpedo squadrons, every single Japanese escort fighter had been dragged down to sea level to intercept them. Furthermore, the eyes of the Japanese anti-aircraft gunners were all fixed on the water. At this very moment, the sky 10,000 feet above the Japanese fleet was wide open. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey did not know about the tragedy unfolding on the surface at that moment. As the commander of the Enterprise Air Group, he was leading over 30 SBD Dauntless dive bombers, searching desperately at 20,000 feet. Their fuel was running out. The gauges were pointing to the red zone. If they didn't find the Japanese soon, they would not only fail the mission, but they wouldn't have enough gas to return, forcing them to ditch in the shark-infested ocean. "Skipper, we have to turn back," his wingman warned over the radio. McCluskey gritted his teeth. He wasn't ready to give up. Just then, through the thinning clouds, he saw a white wake on the deep blue sea. It was a small ship, all alone, racing north at full speed. It was a Japanese destroyer, the Arashi. This was perhaps the most famous butterfly effect in military history. Earlier, the Arashi had broken formation to attack an American submarine, the Nautilus, in the area. Now, having finished its task, it was rushing to rejoin the main fleet. McCluskey made the judgment that decided the day, and perhaps the war. Follow that destroyer. It was like a guide to the Reaper. 10 minutes later, 10:22 a.m. When we looked along the heading of the Arashi, everyone held their breath. On the sea ahead, a magnificent and terrifying scene unfolded. The entire Imperial Japanese Navy Mobile Force 4, massive aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, cutting through the waves, surrounded by countless warships. And above them, nothing, not a single Zero fighter. At the same time, Bombing Squadron 3, VB3, from the Yorktown, led by Max Leslie, miraculously arrived from a different direction. This wasn't a carefully planned coordination. It was a coincidence of fate. "Push over! Push over!" McCluskey pushed his stick forward. The SBD bomber opened its dive brakes, the perforated flaps making a distinctive howling sound, exactly like the scream of death. Japanese survivors later recalled that when they looked up at that moment, they saw a silver waterfall. Dozens of American bombers falling from the sky, sunlight glinting off their wings. According to tactical assignment, McCluskey's group should have split to attack the two lead carriers, but due to a communication error, almost all the planes dove on the nearest carrier, the Kaga. In an instant, the Kaga became hell. 4 1,000-pound bombs hit in succession. One exploded near the bridge, killing the captain and all senior officers. Others penetrated the flight deck, detonating the mountains of torpedoes, bombs, and fully fueled planes packed in the hangar. The Kaga was instantly swallowed by a sea of fire. At this moment, the flagship Akagi was temporarily ignored due to the targeting error. In this split second, Lieutenant Dick Best, commander of Bombing Squadron 6, displayed supernatural battlefield situational awareness. He saw his teammates swarming the Kaga and realized the Akagi was being missed. "This flight, follow me." He yanked his stick back, and only 2 wingmen managed to follow him. 3 planes against a supercarrier. Best stared dead into his bomb sight at the giant red sun painted on the flight deck. The wind howled. The altimeter spun wildly. At an extremely low altitude, he pressed the release button. The first bomb, dropped by a wingman, exploded off the bow, sending up a huge geyser. The second bomb, dropped by the other wingman, fell into the sea. The third. That was Dick Best's bomb. This 1,000-pound bomb, as if it had eyes, pierced straight through the flight deck of the Akagi at the midship elevator and exploded right in the center of the hangar deck. At that moment, as Japanese officer Mitsuo Fuchida later described, we heard a thunderous explosion. The planes in the hangar, in the middle of being rearmed, were detonated in a chain reaction. The Akagi, Isoroku Yamamoto's pride, instantly turned into an erupting volcano. Simultaneously, the Yorktown's bombers accurately hit the Soryu-3 bombs turned that carrier into twisted, burning scrap. From 10:22 a.m. to 10:28 a.m., only 6 minutes. These were perhaps the most expensive, most reversal-filled 6 minutes in naval history. The invincible fleet the Imperial Japanese Navy spent decades building collapsed in these 6 minutes. 3 main carriers were burning violently, the smoke blotting out the midday sun. I was in the radio room of the Enterprise, listening to the pilots screaming in near madness. "Hit! Hit! My God, she's burning!" Like a giant torch, Spruance did not celebrate. He knew there was still one Japanese carrier out there, the Hiryu. Its commander was Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, a stubborn samurai considered Yamamoto's successor. Watching his 3 sister ships struggle in the inferno, Yamaguchi did not retreat. He launched a counterattack. Around 11 a.m., the Hiryu's first attack wave took off. Their target was clear: bomb whichever American carrier was closest. Unfortunately, that was the newly repaired Yorktown we watched the blips closing in on radar. The Yorktown launched all her Wildcat fighters to intercept. The battle was fierce, and most of the Japanese dive bombers were shot down, but a few broke through the defense. 3 bombs hit the Yorktown. The tenacious ship caught fire again and went dead in the water, but under the command of Captain Buckmaster, the damage control teams performed another miracle. They extinguished the fires and patched the deck. An hour later, the Yorktown actually started moving again and could even launch and recover aircraft. When the second Japanese attack wave, torpedo bombers this time, arrived, they thought they were seeing a different, pristine American carrier because the Yorktown looked restored. So they attacked 2 torpedoes, hit the port side. This time, the Yorktown couldn't hold on. She listed severely and lost all power. Admiral Fletcher had to transfer to a cruiser, watching the sister ship that had taken all the fire to protect us dying on the water. I felt a sting in my nose. But the Yorktown's sacrifice was valuable. Like a magnet, she drew away all of Japan's counterpunching power. By now, the Hiryu, in order to launch attacks, had exhausted its elite pilots. 2:45 p.m., scouts from the Enterprise finally found the Hiryu. Spruance ordered, "Launch every bomber that can fly." This included planes from the Enterprise, the Hornet, and even the orphans from the Yorktown who had lost their mothership. This wave was a strike of pure vengeance. Dick Best flew again. His lungs were in agony from inhaling caustic oxygen, which would force him to retire after the war, and he was coughing blood, but he insisted on flying. At 5 p.m., the American swarm arrived over the Hiryu. By then, the Japanese had few Zeros left to intercept. 4 bombs hit the Hiryu. She joined the ranks of the burning Tamon Yamaguchi, chose to go down with his ship. As night fell over Midway, 4 massive bonfires burned on the surface of the sea. They were the 4 great ships that once roamed the Pacific: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu. They illuminated the night sky, and they illuminated the beginning of the decline of the Japanese Empire. Yamamoto received this catastrophic news aboard his flagship, the Yamato. According to records we acquired after the war, that night, Yamamoto briefly considered leading his battleship formation in a night attack, attempting to shell Midway and find the American fleet. But Spruance displayed astonishing rationality. He decisively ordered the fleet to withdraw to the east at night, avoiding the night combat at which the Japanese excelled, and moving out of range of Japanese land-based aircraft on Wake Island. Facing an empty ocean and 4 sinking carriers, Yamamoto finally understood that the tide had turned. At 2:55 a.m. on June 5th, Yamamoto issued that painful order. Operation Midway canceled. The Japanese Navy, which once boasted it would sign a peace treaty in the White House in Washington, turned its bow around for the first time and retreated in panic. But this did not mean there were no further sacrifices. On June 6th, while waiting for a tow, the floating Yorktown was spotted by a sneaking Japanese submarine, the I-168. It fired torpedoes. The Yorktown, along with the destroyer USS Hamon, assisting alongside her, finally sank to the bottom of the sea. That was the greatest price we paid for this victory. In the months following the battle, I spent my time compiling reports on the engagement. Even today, in 1982, I often lie awake at night thinking, why did we win? Why did the Japanese lose? It wasn't simple luck. Although the clouds for those 5 minutes and the Arashi acting as a guide were indeed luck, as Pasteur said, chance favors only the prepared mind. First, the absolute victory of intelligence. This was the root cause. Without the codebook from the I-124, without the bloodshot eyes of Rochefort's team in The Dungeon, without that genius freshwater trick, we would never have known AF was Midway. If that were the case, our fleet might have been freezing in the Aleutians or shivering on the west coast, while the rising sun flag flew over Midway. We were playing cards while looking at our opponent's hand. Second, Japanese arrogance and rigidity. This is the so-called victory disease. Yamamoto's plan was too complex. He wanted to achieve too many goals at once: occupy the island, destroy the enemy, feint at the Aleutians. He dispersed his forces, leaving Nagamo without battleship anti-aircraft cover at the critical moment. Even more fatal was the intelligence negligence. A Japanese scout plane, number 4 from the cruiser Tone, launched 30 minutes late due to a catapult malfunction. Those 30 minutes were fatal. If they had found us earlier, Nagumo might have launched an immediate strike, and it might have been the Enterprise burning furthermore. Nagumo's indecision on the battlefield, the famous rearming order, switching from torpedoes for ships to bombs for land and back again. left the hangars full of ordnance violating safety protocols, turning the carriers into powder kegs. Third, American courage and sacrifice. This is not just cold strategy. The victory belongs to Waldron and his Torpedo Squadron 8, to those young men who flew straight into a wall of fire, knowing they would die. It was their sacrifice that pulled down the Japanese air defense net. Victory belongs to McCluskey's decisiveness, to Dick Best's stroke of genius, to Nimitz's trust, and to Spruance's cool head with blood, wisdom, and steel. We forcibly pushed the wheel of history in a different direction. The end of the Battle of Midway marked the complete reversal of the Pacific War. Before this, we were retreating, defending, guessing where the Japanese knife would fall next. After this, the initiative changed hands. Japan lost its 4 best carriers, and more importantly, they lost over 300 battle-hardened elite pilots and countless skilled ground crew. For resource-poor Japan, this was a wound that could never heal, and the American war machine was just warming up. Essex-class aircraft carriers were being churned out of shipyards like sausages. 2 months later, in August 1942, the U.S. launched Operation Watchtower, and Marines landed on Guadalcanal. That was the beginning of the long and bloody island-hopping campaign. Starting from Midway, we would step by step across the bloody beaches of Tarawa, through the jungles of Saipan, over the black sands of Iwo Jima to Okinawa, and finally straight to Tokyo. As I finish these memories, the rain outside has stopped. The setting sun pierces the clouds, dyeing the San Diego Naval Base in gold. Modern nuclear-powered aircraft carriers are docked in the harbor, the descendants of the Enterprise. But I still miss that humble basement. I miss the sound of punch cards. I still remember Lieutenant Commander Waldron drinking whiskey in that shabby club for the damn job, he said. Yes, for the job, for freedom, so that our children wouldn't all be speaking Japanese. Midway was not just a naval battle, it was a contest of human will. On this battlefield woven of intelligence and steel, we proved that even in the darkest hour, as long as there is courage to face the abyss and wisdom to see through the fog, no enemy is invincible. This text is dedicated to all the spirits resting eternally in the waters of Midway.